Brian Joseph is Distinguished University Professor of Linguistics and the Kenneth E. Naylor Professor of South Slavic Linguistics at Ohio State University. His scholarly focus is on historical linguistics, especially pertaining to the history of Greek language, ancient through modern, in both its geographic and contact-related context. His current research involves field work among the Greek-speaking communities of southern Albania and explorations into the history of Albanian and into Balkan language contact more generally. His forthcoming book on the Balkan languages, co-authored with Victor Friedman, will be published in 2019. So I will invite Brian Joseph to take over for the rest of this part of the morning.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you all for being here. I want to welcome you to this panel where we'll be exploring events that are from the distant past, but have an impact on all of us here today and on all parts of the globe. The topic is the Indo-Europeanization of Europe, and our brief program will offer an introduction to the issues and some of the complexities. Indo-European refers to a large family of languages. We often represent these families as family trees, and here as a real tree. Well, sort of real. And the languages include English, Russian, Greek, Hindi, and many other modern and many ancient languages as well, from India into Europe, hence the term Indo-European. These languages are said to be genetically related by linguists, genetically related, where the relevant sense of genetic is not the biological notion that we'll actually be hearing about later from one of our panelists, but rather it derives from the Greek word genetikos in its etymological sense of pertaining to genesis, pertaining to origins. So a linguistic genetic relationship means that the languages have a common origin. We now sometimes use the term genealogical, we linguists at least, to avoid possible confusion with the biological notion and to avoid any misleading assumptions that biological DNA has anything to do with which language a given person speaks. Now, Indo-European is an appropriate term given where the languages of the family were located when serious study of them and of their interrelationships began. But the family has been called by other names over the years, some of which you can still encounter. Indo-Hittite is one, though this has more to do with the theory behind the internal structure of the relations of the member languages within the family. And if we were to talk about the Indo-Hittitization of Europe, besides being a mouthful, it would not quite work if the specific branches of Indo-Hittite that made it into Europe were not the languages of Anatolia, the Hittite and the languages most closely related to it. So that's not really the best term that we could use in this regard. Another term that you see is Indo-Germanic, based on the German Indo-Germanische, from which the Indo-Germanicization of Europe would be a possible turn of phrase, but probably infelicitous due to images it might invoke of a World War II-like German territorial expansion. There was also Japhetic, which the Egyptologist at Berlin in the middle of the 19th century, Carl Richard Lepsius, used. It was based on an idea that was popular in Europe in the 1600s, that Japhet, who was one of Noah's 3 sons, was the source ultimately of the peoples of Europe and the languages, therefore. His 2 brothers, Shem or Sem and Ham, were seen as the source of the Semitic and the Hamitic peoples, respectively, and the languages as well. Here they are, in case you were wondering what they look like. And I think from our point of view, though, talking about the Japheticization of Europe just doesn't have quite the same ring to it. It's rather opaque. So we'll stick with Indo-European as the name of the family, language family, and Indo-Europeanization as the topic of our discussion today. In the standard view of things, starting from a small group of speakers many millennia ago, somewhere in the region between Europe and Central Asia, the so-called Indo-European homeland, the Indo-European spread westward into Western Europe as well as moving eastward into the Indian subcontinent. This is a sort of standard view of these movements. Now, I'm being somewhat vague about the details. I said many millennia ago, I said somewhere in the region, because they are a matter of some controversy that our speakers today will actually be shedding some light on. Some of the key issues that will be addressed, or that one needs to consider in general, are where was that homeland, when was that homeland, and what led the Indo-Europeans to move as they did. The where is a key area of dispute, but it's whether the Indo-European homeland is to be located somewhere in the steppes of Eastern Europe, in the general region of eastern Ukraine and southern Russia, or instead is to be located in Anatolia. As for the when question, the conventional date that linguists have generally worked with for the date of the Proto-Indo-European speech community is about 6,500 years before present, a date that allows for the development of the diversity of structure and lexicon that one sees in the attested Indo-European languages of the second millennium BC, Hittite and other Anatolian languages, Greek and Sanskrit especially, while at the same time recognizing the commonality among them. Others working with a different methodology, in particular borrowing from the phylogenetic methods employed by evolutionary biologists, have come up with deeper dates of about 9,000 years before present. And we will hear about these methodologies and their results. And as for the why question, there's the view that the spread was due to horse domestication and the greater mobility and possibility that it offered for conquest, as opposed to a more pastoral view that it was the spread of agriculture that drove the Indo-Europeans' mobility. Now, whether they moved south into Anatolia, including the Balkans, depends on where they were to start with. So these are questions that have ramifications. Now, linguists generally think of all languages as being important in the sense of telling us something about the human faculty of language and how language emerges in individuals and societies. Or, as one might say here in Philadelphia, we hold it to be a truth that is self-evident, that all languages are created equal. It's also a fact, though, that through various accidents of history, individual languages have come to take on a greater social importance and cultural importance for large numbers of people. And that can be said about Indo-European. Now, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson famously asked a few weeks ago, why should American taxpayers care about Ukraine? Well, we might ask that same question here in a slightly altered form and also in its original form. The original form of Tillerson's question is especially appropriate here if the Indo-European homeland is in fact to be located in the general area of today's Ukraine, as we'll be hearing about. The altered form would be why is it that what happened with the Indo-Europeans thousands of years ago should be considered important to anyone, especially people here in the United States and elsewhere. So why indeed should we consider the Indo-Europeanization of Europe to be an interesting and important issue? I have several answers to this. First, it is intrinsically interesting because it involves attempts to gain insight into events from thousands of years ago and involves multidisciplinary perspectives: linguistics, archaeology, biology, genetics, computer science, and others. The Indo-European languages also are important in practical terms now for several reasons having to do with geography and demographics, but also what we can call humanistic and scientific achievements. This almost unreadable slide tells you that Indo-European languages are spoken by millions of speakers. 7 of the top 10 languages, counting native speakers, are Indo-European: Spanish, English, Hindi, Portuguese, Bengali, Russian, and Punjabi, totaling some over 1.5 billion speakers, nearly 26% of the world's population in 2010. And even more if we add in second language speakers who use an Indo-European language on a regular basis, even if they're not native speakers. English is found all over the world, French in West Africa, for instance. That bumps it up to over 2.5 billion, roughly 33% of the total population. So there's significant numbers of people who are involved in Indo-European languages, whether they know it or not. And The Indo-European languages are official state, that is, national languages on all of the continents except for Antarctica. We count Afrikaans in South Africa, as well as French and English in parts of West Africa, such as Senegal and the Gambia. And even if it's not official in Antarctica, we at least know from yesterday's presentation that English is spoken there on a regular basis by the Thompsons and their crew when they are there. But there are also important non-political reasons, that is, great human accomplishments that happen to involve Indo-European languages. It's important works for many languages, or many religions have been written and produced in Indo-European languages. The Rig Veda for Hinduism, the New Testament for Christianity, the Dhammapada for Buddhism. There's great literature, the Greek epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, Beowulf, the Old Irish Tyne, the Sanskrit epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. And there's the accomplishment of, by Panini and others in India some 2,500 years ago, the Indian grammarians, who produced as sophisticated and complete a grammatical account of a language, in this case Sanskrit, as any that has been done since. It's an intellectual achievement that has been said to be on a par with the theory of relativity. Now, you might remember that on Thursday, David Spergel was able to teach us relativity in 2 minutes. But I could not possibly begin to teach you Sanskrit grammar in 2 minutes. And yet, Panini and the Indian grammarians put it all together. There are also other achievements that are centered on an Indo-European language. The decipherment by Michael Ventris, with help from others, such as Alice Kober, of the Linear B syllabic writing system, and the demonstration that it's an archaic form of Greek was one of the great accomplishments. In general, investigating any aspect of Indo-European also puts us as part of a long and glorious scholarly tradition of some 200 years or more aimed at discovering facts about the past that would not be determinable without attention to linguistic evidence.